All right. So this is the editor group. We're talking about um, handling states within the content editor. This was sparked on yesterday. There was a question whether we should handle the scenario of people transitioning between the content editor and ASCII, RDoc, and Markdown and back and forth. There's a lot of questions inside the issue, and the purpose of this call is probably to get alignment on where we want to go forth, because initially we're talking about switching content, but it feels like in the last 20 hours, we've kind of come down to a scenario of, let me share my screen. It's probably better. Um, we This was one of the latest proposals about like saving the formats for changing, but then someone said, a friend suggested that we can't really block people changing stuff, because you can just change it in the Git file, in the file system itself, and you can change the type, and then we're back to the same scenario. So um, rather than thinking of it as a new format, we're thinking the content editor is just a new editing experience on top of mainly the default way to edit Markdown. And Enrique, thanks for these diagrams here. It was, what I kind of broke it down was that there was one scenario with an opt-out where you go in and it says like return to the old editor, and that would roll back to the page state to what was persisted previously, and an opt-in first approach where it's um, you go in, you see the existing editor that you're used to, you click new editor, and then you're prompted with the prompt over here. And then whatever mode you choose for editing Markdown, we store that as a preference or local storage, whatever we roll out first, MVC. But that's kind of the general extension idea. And then there was this comment about, instead of using like a custom file type, we just keep it as a markdown file extension and just use the YAML front matter to specify the format. So that's what I took away from the issue.
There is
It
a
feels, if, yeah.
sorry, Michael.
Mhm.
There is another distinction between the two diagrams. The second
Mhm.
one doesn't have a format um, to specify if you want to use a content editor or not.
Mhm.
That's very important because we are not like changing the file system
Mhm.
used by the wiki to specify which editor you want to use. Instead, just
Mhm.
we use the same markdown format, and then we switch between two editors for that format.
Mhm. Okay. So maybe you can help clarify something for me. Is the kind of like current state of the discussion whether we're choosing this pattern or this pattern to go with? Or is there something else to be discussed?
I think that's accurate. And I'm sorry if I stall out for some reason. My Wi-Fi says it's having trouble, but I would take a step back and just recap some of the discussions we had a couple weeks ago about using this format selector as a way to introduce the opt-in for the new content editor. One of our major concerns was the potential for incompatibility in the file formats. And so we discussed, rather than create a proprietary format, we add a new extension that's really markdown under the hood, but it signals to the wiki that this is a different type of file that can be edited in the content editor. And so then we went down this path of like, how do we switch between formats? Because you can do that now, even though it's not great. It's not great in the sense that like they're not fully compatible. We're not doing translations. Like if you write a link in Markdown and switch to RDoc, it doesn't make the link in RDoc. It just ends up with text. So I think the reason I personally would favor this one that's up on the screen now, which is which is not using the format selector to determine which editor to use. The reason I like this is because it telegraphs our intention better, which is that this is a Markdown editing experience, or an editor that is currently focused on editing Markdown files. It's not a Markdown editor, but I think going the other path will make it seem like we're trying to build a proprietary format, and even though we're not. So yes, there's still a risk, like if I opt in, so just left to right, if I'm on a wiki page and I'm creating a new page and I say, oh, I like new things, I'm going to try this new editor out, and I click that, and now I have somewhat less functionality because we're still working on rounding out all the different node types for GitLab flavored Markdown, then I have a path to get back to Markdown. But I think what we want to avoid is a path to then switch to RDoc or something like that. And then vice versa. Like I think one of the concerns was like in any edit mode, this format switcher maybe doesn't make sense, and it only really should be used when you're creating the new file. But since it exists now, how can we work around that? I think adding a little bit of front matter to a Markdown file and allowing the opt-in and opt-out to happen separate from the file format makes more sense to the long-term plan for the editor.
What do you mean, Eric, about what would be the value of storing this format or storing information about the content editor in the Markdown file? Like, what are we providing to the user with that?
I think right now all we would be nothing to the user. I think this would be for us to key off of and whether we should display warnings or not. And if we don't need, if we can work around that and not need any front matter, that's even better. I think the discussion, that my understanding of it was like we could put some front matter in there so we know which editor created it or which one was last used, so that if it gets opened up in a different editor because you changed the file extension or something like that, we could say, you know, hey, something's not matching up correctly. At this point, though, we don't give errors for any of that anyway. So we're not exactly introducing a new amount of risk to this user flow. We're just kind of calling attention to something that already exists.
Yeah. Actually, like, I think that like what I tried to convey in the alternative here, in the one that is just like allowing the user to choose an animator, was to avoid the idea that you have to switch between the content editor and a different format. Like, if we can avoid the idea that the content editor is like an entirely new format, and we can focus on saying, hey, this is only available for Markdown. And then if you are like switching to a different format, then you immediately are like choosing also like to opt out of the content editor. Like, in some ways, like trying to find a way of like completely removing the complexity of making the content editor interact with other formats.
Yeah, and I'm right with you there. I think those are the right priorities for this presentation of the opt-in, opt-out. I think avoiding any indication that this is a different file format, and instead doubling down on the fact that this is a new editing experience on top of your existing content is definitely where we should be headed. I think the root of this discussion is just how should we handle incompatibilities in this weird transition time when we don't have full support for editing everything. And if we can do that using error messages, if we can gracefully not overwrite data, which I know is not necessarily the case, but if we can find other ways to warn people as they're opting in that, like, hey, these are the things that are supported, these are the things that are not, and we can't really do anything about it if you try it out and start typing unsupported formats, or you switch between formats. Like, the good thing is everything's backed by Git, and so no data is really being lost. You can always get your changes back, but in the case of the wiki, it's not like a super easy process to recover that. So I think we need to be somewhat sensitive to it.
I have a naive question here on my side. Is there any risk of data loss between like the content editor and the markdown editor?
Yes. So imagine that, let's say that the user opens an existing wiki page to edit it. And that page has some markdown that it doesn't, that the content editor doesn't support yet. Like, let's say that it has some mermaid diagrams, and the content editor just can't display it or edit it or recognize it in any ways. When the user tries to save the content after the content editor opened that page and loaded it, the content editor should transform that like a editable version of the content of the page back to Markdown to persist it in the backend. So it's like the conversion process is we take the Markdown, we convert it into a format that is that the content editor can understand, and the user can use the content editor to edit it. And when the user is going to save the changes, we convert that format back to Markdown to persist it in the backend. But if we are if the content editor doesn't recognize an unsupported content type, then it's just going to omit it. It's going to skip it. And that markdown that we generate again won't have that content that we lost. So the risk of data loss, of losing data, happens when the user save the changes.
Okay. When saving. Okay. Is this a correct line? So if I'm using the content editor and for whatever reason it doesn't recognize the content, whatever that may be, then it will be omitted when converting to Markdown when saving. That generally happens when you open an existing Markdown file in the content editor, say the mermaid diagram. We could do something unique like parse it out, but like barring that, it would probably be omitted before the user sees it. Yeah. Or maybe you could elaborate on what happens if I open up a markdown file with a mermaid diagram in the content editor. What would the content editor do?
So I think let me just check my understanding, because I think I've also got a maybe 90% answer there. I think the real problem is what you just described, is going from another type of content to the content editor. So if you're opening a new document in the content editor and typing into it, and then you want to convert to Markdown, it should be fine because
Mm-hmm.
the output of the content editor is Markdown. But if you took an existing Markdown file that had, say, a bunch of issue references or something like that, where we have created links, well, maybe those are a bad example because I'm assuming in the Markdown file they're stored as links, but mermaid diagram, we'll stick with that. It's a special block of code. If the content editor, if Prose Mirror doesn't understand that type of node, my understanding is it will just exclude it from the editor. So you're just dropping it out.
That's right. Like there are some nuances in there, but the core idea is that the way like that node type won't be like correctly interpreted by the content editor, and when it generates Markdown back, it won't be an issue reference anymore. It could be a link. It could not be there at all. But something will happen that it will like destroy that content and remove it
So
from the document.
in the case of a mermaid diagram, because it's represented as a code block, it might be more accurate to say that it'll show up like a code block and it'll be written out as a code block. So it'll no longer ever be represented. The little mermaid text that's added will probably be removed, I imagine, and it'll just be represented by a code block, which is not helpful to anybody. So that's the destructive aspect of this. And if I'm at the risk of underselling the effort to get there, we're probably talking about a handful of releases. I won't even put a number, but a handful of releases before we have full support for GitLab flavored Markdown. In the meantime, I kind of feel right now that that is the only scenario that's risky, and we can probably bypass over engineering the solution with really clear warnings when you open up documents in the content editor about what is supported and what is not. You can make it persist until the user dismisses it or something like that. Link to the docs and make it just very clear that like this is a beta and it doesn't support everything. And if you lost something, just go back in your Git history and recover it.
We could even like because until the user saves the changes, those modifications introduced by the content editor are transient. They are not something that we cannot roll back. So we could even provide a rollback button in the UI that says like, oh, you're not seeing the content as you were expecting. Then like click this button, and then we go back to the persistent version of the document and display it in the old editor. So the user recovers like the original state of the document. So in that way, they don't have to go to Git and do a revert.
It's interesting. So I'm just trying to think through so I open up the wiki, click edit. I'm in the content, I'm in Markdown mode. And I say, oh, what's this new editor? And I click edit in the content editor and I start making changes. Because it's visual, I should know right away that there's content that's messed up. So I could at that point revert my changes, switch back to the old editor and say, just give me the last saved state. But if I didn't notice and clicked commit, that's the point where I would need to revert. Yeah, okay. Again, I think messaging here could solve 90% of this, and the other 10% could be solved by clear documentation about how to revert commits in the wiki.
Something that an idea that Fran pointed out in the discussion in the issue is that at some point we should be able to catch when Prose Mirror doesn't understand or doesn't support that type of node. Like in that case, that would like completely stop the user flow opening the document in the editor. That would solve the problem, but that's not something that we can. I don't know if that's something that we can do right now. Like it's not easily doable because Browse Mirror just, let's say that it doesn't fail when it cannot parse a type of content. So I'm gonna open a discussion in the Browse Mirror forums and see how we can detect that. That would be like the easier solution for the user, I guess, because we are just stopping them from opening something that the content editor cannot edit in the first place.
I think that kind of knowledge about the node types and what is supported would be really helpful, even if we don't completely stop it from opening. But that sounds like a much more clear path to being able to identify parts of the document that we need to sort of isolate or otherwise protect. And that's something we've discussed for a long time. We should certainly start the discussion with Browse Mirror, but it doesn't sound easy or something that's achievable in the next couple milestones.
All right, so this sounds good. I guess we are on alignment that we're going to go down this kind of direction where we would default to the current experience. There'll be some button that like opens the page in a new editor, and then kind of like the next actions is to start looking at different messaging and things like that that could pop up. So perhaps what we could start working on is like the different states that could open it up, like everything's fine, but you don't have your content here, or maybe a combination of all those buttons there. So here's one of return to old editor, but the other scenario that was mentioned was, oh, that mermaid diagram that I expected is like no longer here, or that pulling of that data file to generate the table is like totally gone. So like this page looks kind of different. So those are scenarios where rollbacks might be needed, or like go to return to old editor might be something that's useful here. So, or some kind of history thing.
Yeah, I'll create an issue right after this, so we can discuss and bring in Amy for technical writing help. I think we can distill this down into a concise explanation with maybe two calls to action. One is, so the explanation is, we're in beta, here's what we support, link to the documentation. And then if things aren't looking right, revert, that's your opt-out. And then you could maybe dismiss. Maybe we want to let people dismiss, maybe not. Maybe we need that banner persisted for the next couple milestones. So we can just have that discussion. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think, let's have that discussion, that issue, because that sounds like an interesting one to carry on. But is that enough for you to move on with the kind of like initial work right now, Enrique?
Yes, it is. I think that this simplifies the workflow to just add a button that switches the old editor for the new one when the user decides to. And after that, we can continue refining that experience by adding the warning messages or doing anything that we want to do, like to allow the users to roll back to the safe state.
Okay, great. That sounds good. So, yeah, thanks. This was a productive chat then.
Yeah, thanks for setting it up.
No problem.